"You're nothing without me." Those were his exact words, spat at me with such venom that I can still taste the bitterness 3 years later. And now, as I sit in my corner office on the 42nd floor, watching him through the floor-to-ceiling windows as he wipes down tables at the coffee shop across the street, I realize he was right about one thing. I am nothing like the person I was when he said those words. I'm so much more. The memory hits me like a physical blow every time I see him down there. My chest tightens, my breathing becomes shallow, and for just a moment, I'm back in our cramped studio apartment, mascara streaming down my face, watching him pack his things into garbage bags because we couldn't even afford proper luggage. I had loved him with the kind of desperate, all-consuming love that makes you stupid. Marcus had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, even when that room was filled with more successful, more beautiful, more everything people than me. His laugh was infectious, his ambition seemed boundless, and when he looked at me with those dark eyes and told me we were going to build something incredible together, I believed him with every fiber of my being. We had started the consulting firm in our living room. I remember the excitement thrumming through my veins as we brainstormed company names, as I designed our first logo on my ancient laptop that took 5 minutes to boot up. Digital Dynamic Solutions. It seemed so professional, so full of promise. I handled the business development, the client relations, the financial planning. Marcus was supposed to be the creative genius, the visionary who would revolutionize how small businesses approached their digital presence. For 8 months, I poured everything into that company. I worked 18-hour days, lived on ramen noodles and coffee, turned down social invitations and family gatherings. I was the one who landed our first client, a struggling bakery that needed a website overhaul. I was the one who stayed up until 3 in the morning perfecting proposals, researching market trends, cold calling potential clients until my voice was hoarse and my fingers cramped from dialing. Marcus, meanwhile, spent most of his time talking about the big picture. He'd lounge on our secondhand couch, laptop balanced on his chest, speaking in grand terms about scaling and market disruption, while I handled the actual work of building our client base. When I'd ask him about specific deliverables, he'd wave me off with that charming smile and assure me he was working on something revolutionary that would change everything. I should have seen the signs. The way he'd become evasive when I asked about his progress. The phone calls he'd take in the bathroom, speaking in hushed tones. The suddenly secretive behavior around his laptop. But I was so consumed with keeping our business afloat, so desperate to prove that we could make this work, that I ignored the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. The betrayal came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was our weekly client check-in day, and I was feeling particularly optimistic. We'd just signed 2 new accounts, and for the first time since we'd started, we were going to make enough money to cover both rent and groceries in the same month. I was practically bouncing with excitement as I burst through our apartment door, ready to share the good news. Marcus was sitting at our tiny kitchen table, but he wasn't alone. Jessica Chen, our former colleague from the marketing agency where we'd met, was across from him. They both looked up when I entered, and the guilt written across their faces was so obvious it was almost comical. Almost, if it hadn't felt like someone had just ripped my heart out through my throat. The conversation that followed was a blur of accusations, tears, and the kind of pain that makes your bones ache. Jessica had been working with Marcus for months, he explained in that calm, reasonable tone that had once made me feel so secure. They'd been developing their own consulting firm, using the client list I'd built, the processes I'd developed, the reputation I'd cultivated. They'd been planning to launch together for weeks, and I was not invited. The worst part wasn't even the professional betrayal, though that cut deep enough. It was the way Marcus looked at me when I finally understood what was happening. Like I was an obstacle that had finally been cleared from his path. Like I was nothing more than an inconvenience he'd tolerated for as long as it served his purposes. I asked him why, my voice barely above a whisper. Why throw away everything we'd built together? Why destroy what we had? That's when he said it. His face twisted into something ugly, something I'd never seen before. "You're nothing without me, Sarah. You think you're some kind of business genius, but you're just a worker bee. You can execute, but you can't innovate. You can follow, but you can't lead. Jessica and I, we're going to build something real, something that matters. You just hold us back." The words hit me like physical blows. Each syllable was carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, and they succeeded. I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller until I was sure I might just disappear entirely. The confident, ambitious woman I'd been just moments before crumbled into a pile of self-doubt and devastating hurt. They left that afternoon, both of them, taking boxes of files, client contact information, and 3 years of my life with them. I sat in our empty apartment, now just my empty apartment, staring at the walls we'd painted together in optimistic shades of success. The silence was deafening. For 2 weeks, I barely functioned. I ordered takeout when I remembered to eat, which wasn't often. I ignored calls from family and friends. I let our remaining clients' deadlines slip by, too paralyzed by grief and shock to focus on anything productive. I'd lie in bed at night, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for clues I'd missed, wondering if I really was as worthless as Marcus had made me feel. But somewhere in that darkness, something began to shift. Maybe it was the morning I woke up to find an eviction notice slipped under my door. Maybe it was seeing Marcus and Jessica's announcement of their new firm on LinkedIn, complete with the client list I'd built. Maybe it was just the survival instinct finally kicking in after days of wallowing. I remember the exact moment it happened. I was sitting on my bathroom floor, having what was probably my 100th breakdown, when I caught sight of myself in the mirror. My hair was greasy, my eyes were swollen from crying, and I looked exactly like the broken, pathetic person Marcus believed me to be. And I got angry. Not the white-hot, explosive anger that burns out quickly. This was something deeper, colder, more sustained. It started as a tight ball in my chest and slowly spread through my entire body until my hands stopped shaking and my breathing became steady and purposeful. You're nothing without me. Maybe that was true. Maybe the version of myself that had existed in our relationship, the one who had deferred to his vision and supported his dreams while neglecting my own instincts, really was nothing without him. But I was about to find out who I could become without him. The first thing I did was make a list. Not an emotional, stream of consciousness rant about my feelings, but a cold, analytical assessment of my assets and capabilities. I had a bachelor's degree in business administration and 2 years of experience at a respected marketing agency. I had successfully built a client base from nothing, developed efficient processes for service delivery, and maintained a 100% client retention rate during my time at Digital Dynamics Solutions. Most importantly, I had something Marcus didn't. The actual skills to deliver results rather than just talk about them. I spent the next month methodically rebuilding my life. I found a studio apartment I could actually afford, one that came furnished so I didn't have to worry about replacing everything Marcus and Jessica had taken. I reached out to former colleagues, not to badmouth my ex-partners, but to let them know I was available for freelance consulting work. I created a new portfolio, highlighting the measurable results I'd achieved for clients. Slowly, work began to trickle in. A small restaurant needed help with their social media strategy. A nonprofit wanted to overhaul their donor communication system. A boutique fitness studio was struggling with their online booking process. None of these were the big, prestigious accounts Marcus had always talked about pursuing, but they were real businesses with real problems that I could actually solve. And solve them I did. The restaurant saw a 40% increase in online engagement within the first month. The nonprofit's donor retention rate improved by 25%. The fitness studio streamlined their booking process so efficiently that they were able to take on 30% more clients without hiring additional staff. Word began to spread. Not through flashy marketing campaigns or bold proclamations about disrupting industries, but through the old-fashioned method of delivering exceptional results and letting satisfied clients become your best advocates. Within 6 months, I had more work than I could handle alone. Within a year, I was turning down projects because my calendar was completely booked. By month 18, I hired my first employee, a bright recent graduate named Kevin, who reminded me of myself before Marcus had systematically undermined my confidence. I called my company Sterling Consulting Solutions, Sterling, because I wanted to convey quality, reliability, and lasting value. Everything Marcus and Jessica's flashy promises weren't. As my client base grew, so did my confidence. I began to remember who I'd been before I'd lost myself in someone else's vision of success. I started trusting my instincts again, pushing back when clients had unrealistic expectations, raising my rates to reflect the value I was providing. I invested in professional development, attending conferences and workshops, not because someone else told me I needed to improve, but because I was genuinely excited about expanding my capabilities. The real breakthrough came in my second year. One of my clients, a regional chain of home improvement stores, was struggling with a comprehensive digital transformation. They needed someone who could not only develop a strategy, but also manage its implementation across multiple locations, coordinate with various technology vendors, and train their staff on new systems. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes project Marcus used to dream about landing, the kind that would establish a consulting firm as a serious player in the industry, and they came directly to me. The project took 8 months to complete and generated more revenue than I'd made in my entire first year of business. But more than the financial success, it proved to myself that I was capable of handling the big, complicated challenges I'd once believed were beyond my abilities. By the end of year 2, I had a team of 5 employees and a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies. I moved Sterling Consulting Solutions into a proper office space, complete with a conference room and a coffee machine that didn't require percussive maintenance to function properly. That's when I started seeing Marcus again. Not intentionally at first. I was leaving a client meeting at one of the downtown office towers when I spotted him through the window of a Starbucks. He was behind the counter, wearing the green apron and forced smile of a food service worker. My first instinct was to keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But something made me stop and really look. He'd aged more than the 2 years that had passed would suggest. His hair was thinner. His face had a tired, defeated quality that was jarringly different from the confident man who'd once assured me he was destined for greatness. He was taking an order from a businessman in an expensive suit, nodding deferentially as the customer gestured impatiently at the menu board. I should have felt satisfaction seeing him brought so low. Instead, I felt something more complicated, a mixture of vindication and sadness, and something that might have been pity. I did some research that night. It wasn't hard to find information about what had happened to Digital Dynamics Solutions. The business review websites told the story in painful detail. Missed deadlines, undelivered promises, clients who'd paid deposits for services that were never completed. Marcus and Jessica had lasted about 18 months before their reputation caught up with them, and their client base evaporated entirely. Jessica had managed to land another job at a different marketing agency, taking a significant step down from the senior position she'd held before. Marcus hadn't been so lucky. According to his LinkedIn profile, which hadn't been updated in over a year, he'd had a series of short-term positions since Digital Dynamics folded. Sales associate, customer service representative, administrative assistant, and now apparently barista. I found myself walking past that Starbucks regularly, though I never went inside. Sometimes he'd be there, sometimes he wouldn't. When he was, I'd watch him through the window. This man who'd once told me I was nothing without him, asking customers if they wanted to upgrade their order or add a pastry. It became a sort of ritual, this observation of his diminished circumstances. Not out of cruelty, but out of a need to remind myself how far I'd come from that broken woman crying on her bathroom floor. Every time I saw him wiping down tables or restocking cups, I'd think about the board meeting I'd just left, or the new client presentation I was preparing, or the team member I was about to promote. The contrast was so stark it was almost surreal. My business continued to grow. Year 3 brought international clients and speaking engagements at industry conferences. Year 4 saw the launch of our digital analytics division and our first acquisition, a smaller consulting firm that specialized in crisis communications. By the beginning of Year 5, Sterling Consulting Solutions had 42 employees and offices in 3 cities, and Marcus was still making lattes. I knew because I'd started having my morning coffee delivered from that particular Starbucks. Not because their coffee was exceptional, but because I'd developed a perverse fascination with the symmetry of it all. The woman he'd dismissed as worthless was now successful enough to have an assistant who picked up her daily coffee order while he was the one preparing it. My assistant, Emma, mentioned him one morning as she set my usual order on my desk. "There's this guy at the Starbucks who always asks about you," she said casually. "Wants to know if you're the Sarah Mitchell who runs Sterling Consulting." I told him that was confidential client information, obviously, but he seemed really insistent. Kind of desperate, actually. My heart skipped several beats. After all this time, he'd figured out who was behind the daily coffee orders. I wondered what he was thinking, what he might be planning. Part of me was curious enough to consider going there myself, to see what he had to say after all these years. But a larger part of me realized that nothing he could say would matter anymore. The woman who had once hung on his every word, who had shaped her entire identity around being his partner, no longer existed. In her place was someone who had built something real and lasting, not through grand visions or empty promises, but through consistent execution and genuine value creation. I thought about the last time we'd spoken, about the venom in his voice when he'd told me I was nothing without him. He'd been wrong, but not in the way either of us could have predicted at the time. I wasn't nothing without him. I was everything I'd never had the chance to become with him. The irony was almost poetic. In trying to diminish me, he'd forced me to discover my own strength. In abandoning our partnership, he'd given me the space to build something entirely my own. In telling me I was nothing without him, he'd motivated me to prove that he was nothing compared to what I could accomplish alone. I stopped having my coffee delivered from that Starbucks after that conversation with Emma, not out of fear or avoidance, but because I no longer needed the reminder of how far I'd come. The contrast between who I'd been and who I'd become was evident in every success, every client testimonial, every employee who looked to me for leadership and direction. There was a board meeting that afternoon where we discussed our expansion into European markets. As I presented our 5-year growth projections to a room full of investors and advisors, I thought about Marcus wiping down tables just 42 floors below me. The thought didn't bring me the savage satisfaction I might have expected. Instead, it brought a sense of closure, of a chapter finally and definitively ended. That evening, I drafted an email to Emma asking her to find a new coffee shop for our daily orders. Something closer to the office, I wrote, with better pastries and a more convenient location. I didn't mention the real reason, that I no longer needed to see physical proof of Marcus's diminished circumstances to feel confident in my own success. As I prepared to leave the office that night, I paused at my windows and looked down at the street below. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably finishing his shift, untying his apron, counting his tips. Tomorrow he'd wake up and do it all again, serving coffee to people like me, people who'd built the kind of success he'd once believed was his destiny. And tomorrow, I'd wake up as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar consulting firm with a team of brilliant people who respected my leadership and clients who valued my expertise. I'd make decisions that affected dozens of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. I'd be everything he'd told me I could never become. You're nothing without me. 3 years later, those words had become the foundation of everything I'd built. Not because they were true, but because they'd forced me to prove how spectacularly wrong they were. I gathered my things and headed toward the elevator, already thinking about tomorrow's client presentation and the strategic planning session scheduled for next week. As the elevator descended past floor after floor of the success I'd created, I realized that Marcus had given me something valuable after all. He'd given me the gift of his absence, and I'd used it to build an empire.